Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler Unscripted, the podcast available on SoundCloud, Spotify, iTunes and any other podcast player you might enjoy, but also as a video here on YouTube. In today's episode I'd like to speak about Panerai. Panerai is a very historic brand which is well over 100 years old, has a fantastic military history and which was resurrected, you could say, in 1997 by the Vendôme Group, now the Richemont Group, in a form which we now recognise today as a luxury dive watch producer. But it's a brand which enjoyed a few years of real success in those early 2000s years during that period, but nowadays is facing trouble in terms of remaining relevant. It's a brand which has evolved an awful lot, but is struggling to produce watches which maintain the interest of collectors and casual buyers alike. And so today I'd like to speak about the curse of a very particular history, which is that of Panerai, and what Panerai seems to have been getting wrong over the last few years, but also why I think there is hope for this brand, and I think they're turning themselves in a very interesting direction, particularly with releases over the last year and a half or so. Before I begin though, if you enjoy this podcast, please do remember to follow us on Instagram to be able to catch all the latest about our videos, podcasts and articles, and also head over to WATCHCHRONICLER.com to be able to read these articles, listen to the podcasts, and catch all the latest, where we keep the majority of Watch Chronicler content so you never miss a thing. So why am I talking about Panerai today? Well, a couple of months ago, a rather interesting Radiomir was launched, but a lot of people described it as being interesting for the wrong reasons. This was the PAM 2020, a watch designed as a celebration piece. It took the same format as almost any other Radiomir you could expect, with the polished case, the very curved cushion shape, as well as the attached lugs and the domed crystal. It had a brown sunburst dial and the typical sandwich dial arrangement. But this piece had an additional signature at 6 o'clock, which read Paneristi 2000 to 2020. This rather unsightly engraved logo was a celebration of 20 years of the community which in many ways popularised Panerai as a luxury brand in the early 2000s. So far this is all well and good, but then you have to think about what Paneristi are today. Today this is a community with, and I apologise for anyone who was a member or is a member, but with very little influence. There's far less popularity around Panerai than there was back in the day, and really over the last decade they've in essence repeated themselves for a large part of this time with watches which look essentially the same. Of course there have been technical advances, and there have been improvements. I won't make any sort of excuse for that not taking place. It's very clear that it has taken place, but you have to note the fact that this brand is nowhere near as popular as it was, and so it seems in some ways rather unfortunate that this brand is celebrating an anniversary which in many ways is not the glorious occasion which you would hope it would be. When you add this to an assortment of limited editions over the last few months to celebrate, amongst other things, the 70th anniversary of the Panerai Luminor, you see a range of watches which tend to use gimmicks to sell products, whether it's a new case material which is unusual and different, or watches with an unusual feature like a 70-year warranty, which for the price they're asking is neither here nor there, but certainly it is a gimmick to get watches out of the shops. You can add on top of this the various stories on social media where Panerai have reposted images of fake Panerais, and you get a sense that this is a brand which is struggling to remain relevant during this time. Now, a lot of attention has been directed towards Panerai over the last few months by the website Periscope, with Jose Perestroika, a very famous individual in his field as a researcher of Panerai, and an individual who's done an awful lot to demonstrate what actually took place during this brand's history, and I encourage you to look at his website, which I'll link below, because he has some fantastically interesting work there. But in any case, this seems a brand which is facing a serious identity crisis, and I think it would be very sad to see this brand either vanish into obscurity or simply no longer be relevant. Panerai is dealing with a brand background which I don't think is particularly well set up for a luxury market, particularly with the various stories, claims, and historical anecdotes which are often associated with Panerai, many of which simply aren't correct. But to understand all of this, I'd first like to start with a quick recap of some of the most important parts of Panerai's history in relation to what they are today. Now, Panerai's history in common knowledge, you could say, begins in the 1930s when they started producing watches for the Royal Italian Navy, and they produced dive watches in essence. You could argue that these were the earliest of dive watches because they were highly technical watches designed for use almost exclusively underwater by the Italian Navy's frogmen. And so they developed this very particular appearance of watch with these sandwich dials, which were incredibly bright and very, very legible thanks to radium coatings, as well as the fact that they used Rolex's cases. So Rolex supplied larger cases specifically for their applications, and they used manually wound or large manually wound movements, which you could find similarities with movements either in clocks or in pocket watches. These were quite often Rolex movements, and I will add I am oversimplifying their history enormously, but I encourage you to read articles about the subject because it is a very interesting story. And they brought out a variety of important innovations throughout the years, whether it was the evolution of the original Radiomir with its wire lugs and rather simple case all the way through to the Luminor with its unique crown design in order to lock the crown in place, in order to remain functional and remain a tool, which in essence these were. But skipping through their history, they did eventually move away from using Rolex cases and Rolex movements, and used some Angelus movements for instance, and their first, to the best of my knowledge, independently designed watch was the Egiziano, a 60mm dive watch designed for the Egyptian Navy. This appeared in the mid-1950s. But Panerai continued to produce watches for a few years after that point, but in the 1990s started to produce civilian watches, and this is when they began to develop a certain appeal. But this was still a very disorganised jumble of watches appearing from the brand, and in the late 90s, in 1997, the brand was bought by the Vendôme Group, which then became the Richemont Group, and this became suddenly a brand forced into the world of luxury watches. Initially it seems the recreation of the brand was rather half-hearted, but it did develop quite quickly as the fan base celebrated by this 20th anniversary watch developed and grew. And so by the mid-2000s, this was a very popular brand, which really was only going upward. Nevertheless, the collector's market for Panerai's vintage watches doesn't seem to be anywhere like as strong as that of other major brands, and there are a few reasons I could suggest for this. I shan't state them as necessarily the truth, but for example, there are an awful lot of counterfeit watches produced by a number of particular families in Italy, and these may have hurt the interest, or rather the trust in these watches to a certain extent. But in recent years, Panerai has had a rather prickly relationship with providing new and interesting watches. Because you see, fundamentally every watch in the Panerai catalogue fulfills a very similar purpose. They recreate that cushion Rolex-style case from Panerai's early years, with a few notable exceptions, it must be said, but the vast majority recreate this very classical design and don't really advance on what they've produced. Now, of course, there are new movements introduced, and some of their new in-house movements are fantastic. But the way I see this, you could picture Panerai as a brand which wants to produce a tool watch from a historical era and for a historical era, which doesn't really exist anymore, but it can't keep this watch relevant as a luxury piece because it still does want to be designed like that original tool watch, and so it seems stuck in this void of repeating itself with vintage offerings, but without adhering to modern interests or providing for modern interests. And it's a real conundrum, because what do you do with a brand which is rooted even more deeply perhaps than its brand name or background? Its appearance is its selling point, but you have a watch which is so attached to its appearance that it can't move in new directions because it's held back by that appearance. This is a very difficult problem, and I can see why they've struggled with it. Undeniably, Panerai's most famous and most well-known range is their more vintage range. These are watches with a very clear retrospective attitude, a certain water resistance, it must be said, of 100 or 300 metres, with a notable exception which I'll mention a little bit later on. But these are watches which have a very simple design, usually 2 or perhaps 3 hands, maybe a complication but usually none, and these tend to be manually wound. These are lovely watches, it can't be denied, but they repeat the design of the past so closely that at this point it's almost impossible to differentiate one from another unless you are a real enthusiast and have a particular interest. This isn't a problem you have with, let's say, Rolex or Omega, where their individual collections and lines look very different even to the untrained or uninterested eye. But of course there are a lot of brands which don't stray far from their history, and understandably, because it is nice to be able to hark back to those glory days. Look at, for example, Doxa. This is a brand which, even in its most recent and most modern versions of the Doxa sub, is still a brand which celebrates itself. It celebrates its history, it celebrates its achievements, with a watch which looks very similar to the ones worn about 50 years ago at this point. But the difficulty is that Panerai's history is much more complicated. Of course, their watches weren't manufactured by Panerai in their entirety. The cases were produced by Rolex, the movements were almost always third-party, and so it's difficult to see where the parts of this watch can come together to celebrate the brand rather than the way these watches were created, which doesn't really add much glory to Panerai as a brand themselves, even though they did do an enormous amount to advance these watches as better dive watches. And then, of course, you have the difficulty, which is that their celebrated moments in the 1940s came during a very dark time, it has to be said, and I won't dwell on this point, but it has to be remembered that even the famous logo for those Italian frogmen in the mid-1940s, the skull with a rose in its mouth, was developed when this was, in essence, a diving group operating for the Nazis. On this particular point, I don't think that Rolex or Panerai, both of the brands associated with the production of these watches, were providing intentionally to these particular groups. Certainly it seems like Rolex was very reluctant to sign these watches during that period, but the fact that they still supplied them to Panerai suggests that they were trying to help out Panerai in a very difficult time. So I think they've covered themselves very well, and I don't think are responsible, but it's still very difficult to separate a brand from a very difficult and very dark part of history. So what else have Panerai tried to diversify or look for new directions for their brand? Well, a release which springs to mind was the Luminor Due, which was launched in 2016 as essentially a reduced Panerai design, which was taken and removed from any sort of diving connotations for which it was originally conceived. These watches have no functional water resistance and have a slimmer case, but take the original Panerai design. This means that you have a brand which is associated with the sea, yet you have a watch which now looks like it can go in the sea but can't, and it's not exactly a cheap watch either, which I think is a fundamentally odd view of things. Even if they wear well, the authenticity of this brand was always a selling point, and one which seems alienated by this particular choice. Of course, Panerai do also have a highly technical collection within, for example, their Luminor submersible range, but this has been fraught with problems too. Take, for example, the BMG-Tech models. Now, I first handled one of these watches at Salon QP, the final iterations, it turned out, of that show, and the individuals there from the Panerai boutique in New Bond Street were delighted to show me the watch and were incredibly helpful and very friendly, but they showed to me some of the elements which people don't like about these watches. They spoke to me about the fact that people often saw them as being too big and were reluctant to move in that direction where these new materials were concerned, and at the time I simply assumed this was because people weren't used to these materials. By the way, BMG-Tech is in essence a glass made out of metal, so it is a sort of ceramic. But problems here weren't exactly uncommon, as indeed if someone tried to unscrew the bars in order to release the strap, it did happen upon occasion. This would crack the case, which is a serious problem in a large 47mm watch which you're going to knock around. But I think the most problematic element here within this brand's moves is that they haven't valued their more approachable entry-level watches. Let's be honest, with a brand like Panerai, a technical brand, a lot of people are going to want to approach this brand from the perspective of aspiring to own one. And so inevitably the entry level of the brand has to be perfect. But for the last few years, Panerai doesn't seem to want to draw attention to its base models. And these models have interesting movements, make no mistake, but they don't have anything like the flair or, more importantly, the publicity of Panerai's 10, 20, £30,000 watches. Even so, I can see why it would be a difficult proposition to develop this base range to be able to appeal to a wider audience and therefore bring more people into the brand, because ultimately they don't seem to currently have the value to beat Tudor at this particular price, but they also don't have the quality or engineering to beat Omega, or the sheer span of interest, and also appeal in terms of variations to beat a brand like Rolex. Even so, their affordable watches are undeniably good, if you like that sort of thing, and I think there is certainly a future to be seen in Panerai, but it does seem like they do need to focus on a more reliable market, a market for people who are going to be enthusiastic about the brand, not simply limited editions or pieces designed to amaze. Simply producing good quality watches is a fantastic asset to a brand like Panerai, particularly a brand which is so heavily associated with tools. It would be lovely to see them going back in that direction. We did see some appearance of that with the PAM 00961, which is a variant of the submersible with a very new design, which seems very fresh and introduces a new appeal to this historic and often very retrospective brand, particularly with the fact that if you bought this watch in admittedly a very small run at a very high price, you receive the opportunity to be able to train and witness the training of various branches of the Italian Navy, which I think seems like a fantastic option for someone who really wants to understand the Panerai DNA. And that's exactly what they need to cultivate in this admittedly fascinating, particularly historically fascinating brand. But what do you think of Panerai? Do you feel they're going in a good direction, or do you feel they've lost their way? There seems to be an awful lot of discussion about this point, and I think it would be very sad to see Panerai disappear because they're not desperately popular at the present time. So do leave your comments in the comment section below, and like, share and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, as well as following us on whichever podcast player you enjoy using. So thank you very much for listening and watching. This is Armon from WatchChronicler.com, out.